have you decided to announce that steel prices will be rising, surcharges will be rising?
Well, Lerato, if you look at the iron ore and steel industry worldwide, it's in quite a bit of turmoil. If you looked at actually the lead in the Financial Times yesterday and today, the big story is the end of the benchmark pricing in the iron ore trade, and it is estimated that iron ore costs to the steel makers will rise 100%. And right off that announcement, it became clear that steel prices will rise. It's being estimated by as much as a third. Now, South Africa is part of the global steel trade, part of the global iron ore trade, and so some of that will spill over into our local markets. But the specific reason for the surcharge that we announced on Tuesday are really very specific to South Africa. It is because Kumba informed Arcelor Mittal South Africa that it would end the supply of cost plus 3% in terms of its iron ore to us. And clearly, if your costs rise fairly quickly, fairly dramatically, it is quite normal for a business to move to protect its profitability, and that's what Arcelor Mittal South Africa has
Let's talk a little bit about that dispute with Kumba, because many people are seeing the latest move as a need on your part to compensate for what people see as a lack of oversight in terms of not anticipating the end of that favourable term deal with Kumba.
Well, I know quite a lot has been said about that, and clearly we've made it clear we're going to go into arbitration over that process, and so I can't speak about the details of that too specifically, given that it's now going to be part of a legal process. But all I will say is that at the unbundling between what was then ISCO and its mining assets, which then became Kumba, clearly by that time in 2001, it was already foreseen that there would be a new mineral rights regime in South Africa. And in the unbundling agreement between the two companies, there was a good faith clause in which the two companies made reciprocal undertakings that they would ensure that ISCO's rights to this cheap source of iron ore would prevail under the new mineral rights regime. The fact that we're sitting here today talking about a cessation potentially, or at least according to Kumba, of that agreement means that things didn't go quite as was expected. But clearly, from an Arcelor Mittal South Africa perspective, we believe very firmly that that agreement is legally binding and valid, and that we are still entitled to receive.
Why did you wait for it to come to this point? I think many people are wondering. I mean, there's always a legal review close on to the expiration date of a contract. You should have known this was going to happen, and that without renewing the prospecting rights, Kumba would take the stand.
Well, of course we would have known. In fact, the discussions between Kumba and Arcelor Mittal started as far back as 2004. And in that whole period between 2004 and 2006, the two teams were discussing joint conversion processes, Kumba taking the lead. Remember that Arcelor Mittal owns 21.4% of this undivided interest in Sishen mine, and Kumba owns 78%. So Kumba is the miner, it is the majority owner, it takes responsibility for everything to do with the mine. We are steel makers. So it was not a case of we woke up in 2009 and we'd lost the right. This has got quite a historical context to it.
What do you make of the very negative response by the Department of Trade and Industry to this proposed rise in steel prices? There's even talk that they may want to take it to the Competition Commission.
I don't think one would be surprised at the reaction, given that the main thrust for DTI is to ensure that input costs remain low. You've got electricity going up, you now have steel going up. So clearly, from an industrialization policy point perspective, there's a problem there, and I can well understand that. So the fury, if one is to be quite blunt, of the reaction is not in itself surprising. What is surprising is the direction at Arcelor Mittal. Arcelor Mittal received higher iron ore costs and passed them on to some extent. We didn't pass on the full cost. Right. So the fact that the fury is not being directed at the higher iron ore costs, I think, is the surprise. Worldwide, it is being viewed as iron ore increases that are causing the steel prices to rise. So to be expected, I suppose. Okay,
now we are seeing dynamics, as you've alluded to, in terms of changing the negotiating framework for iron ore. Many players like BHP preferring short-term contracts based on spot prices. What's your approach?
Well, we supply industries that can't tolerate the volatility this new pricing regime is going to introduce. Car makers need to be able to price cars well in advance because of the sheer elapsed time of producing their end product. if the tin plate, for example, that we supply to the packaging industry keeps changing up and down, how do you know from one day to the next, when you walk into a supermarket, how much you're going to pay for a can of fish? So it is a very problematic situation for some of the industries that consume steel. And remember, steel constitutes 95% of total metals consumed worldwide. So this is going to have a massive dislocation. The stability that has been there wasn't there as a mistake. It was there really to stabilize production processes further downstream of primary steel.
Now, just in terms of the role that Arcelor Mittal is playing in South Africa in terms of this being termed a developmental state is also quite an issue of debate and contention, it seems, in the sense that the feeling is that you have a responsibility to this economy, and if steel prices rise, it's going to affect quite negatively the ability of the manufacturing sector to be revitalized at the level at which the new industrial policy is hoping to do. And there is a feeling that having taken over from ISCOR, which played a very clear developmental role in this economy, that Arcelor should abide by that principle. Do you accept that you have a responsibility?
Well, of course, but we're not the only company that's got a responsibility. It's a joint responsibility of all companies that operate in South Africa, because we all have a contribution to economic growth, to job preservation and job creation. But my first responsibility is to run a successful, prosperous business. And to run a successful, prosperous business does mean that I do not have the luxury to ignore costs. Cost is a major driver in our industry. And also I have a responsibility to preserve jobs. In order to do that, we have to grow. A company that is not growing is a company that's going to die. So one has to balance a variety of factors in the decisions that management takes. Also, what needs to be borne in mind is that very often a perception develops that one factor above all else drives an industry, but that cannot be the case. There are many other factors beyond steel that are critical for South Africa's industrial base, and those all need to be taken account of. I agree that right now steel is the one that's being focused on, but there are very many more cost drivers in South Africa, labor productivity being one.
What do you make of this entire debacle? Steel prices to rise. Is Arcelor being used as the sacrificial lamb in terms of an economy that needs to have more innovative strategies of growing economies of scale, and we must just accept that steel prices rise because those are market forces?
Possibly. I mean, if you look at the global issues at the moment, I mean, obviously South Africa is such a tiny player. It's the Chinese and the Australians and the Brazilians to a certain extent that are determining how this industry is going. And if the Chinese can't determine or can't reduce steel prices, I mean, the chance that we, even the South African government, is going to be able to go out there and reduce the iron ore prices coming out is a bit of a thing to look at. My question would be, is that without the beneficial, or without the favourable factors you're getting from Kumba at the moment, how viable is the South African steel industry? Do you actually see the South African steel industry being, the size it is, maybe reduced, like totally? What are your views on it if we don't have a favourable iron ore pricing structure in South Africa?
Well, the first thing I will say is that we're not contemplating anytime soon to not win the arbitration. We do believe that status quo will be maintained, and that we have a strong case to put forward to the arbitration panel. But if you then just sort of zoom in on that, clearly what happens is you look at the business from the top down. And you have to restructure your business because your basics have changed. Your business model will have to change in some form, shape or another. But I don't doubt that we would still have a viable domestic steel industry. What may become questionable in the long term is the ability to which we can export product. Now, there are very, very few countries in the world where a steel maker gets iron ore at commercial prices, i.e. it imports the iron ore, makes steel and exports the steel. That's very, very unusual. Typically then you just become a domestic player. And typically, yes, steel prices in South Africa would rise. I mean, if you look at the pricing aspects of it, what doesn't get articulated clearly enough is that we have seen very clearly that if we have adopted the basket pricing methodology in a rising market, in fact steel prices in South Africa are lower than they are globally. We saw this very clearly in 2008. So I think that the methodology that we've adopted in terms of at least reflecting the more beneficial iron ore costs in South Africa does benefit local industry at certain points in the cycle.